Soviet factory evacuation, the greatest industrial move in history. The catastrophe unfolds the morning of June 22, 1941, shattered the fragile peace that had existed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed just 2 years earlier, lay in ruins. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, had commenced with devastating force. German armies, numbering over 3 million men, crossed the Soviet border along a front stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers. The Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and supporting forces advanced with a speed and ferocity that caught the Soviet leadership partly unprepared, despite intelligence warnings of the impending assault. The invasion caught Stalin and his military commanders in a state of shock. The Soviet dictator had believed he had more time before facing Hitler's wrath. He had miscalculated the Nazi leader's ambitions and the speed of German military mobilization. Within hours, German bombers were striking Soviet airfields, destroying thousands of aircraft. German panzer divisions pushed deep into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies. The Red Army, despite its enormous size, was being devastated in the opening weeks of the campaign. What made this invasion particularly catastrophic for the Soviet Union was its timing and direction. The German armies were not advancing into empty steppes. They were driving directly toward the industrial heartland of the Soviet state. The western regions of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia, contained the majority of Soviet industrial capacity. The great factories that had been built during the 1930s as part of Stalin's 5-year plans were concentrated in this region. The coal mines of the Donbass, the steel mills of Ukraine, the oil fields of the Caucasus, the manufacturing centers around Moscow and Leningrad, all lay in the path of the German advance. For the Soviet leadership, the implications were clear and terrifying. A military defeat in the western regions would not merely mean loss of territory, it would mean the loss of the industrial capacity that sustained Soviet power. Nazi Germany, with its superior industrial organization and resources, would only grow stronger with each Soviet factory captured. The Wehrmacht would be supplied with Soviet raw materials and Soviet-manufactured goods. Soviet weapons production would cease. The ability to wage a prolonged war against Hitler's forces would vanish. The Soviet leadership faced a choice that seemed impossible. They could attempt to defend these factories, hoping that military resistance could hold back the German tide, or they could accept that the Wehrmacht would overrun the western regions and make a decision that had never been attempted on such a scale before. Evacuate the factories themselves, not abandon them to the enemy, but remove them, all of them, from danger. This was not a choice made lightly or with full confidence. In early July 1941, as German forces continued their rapid advance, Stalin and his Politburo made a decision that would reshape the course of the war. The factories would be evacuated. Entire industrial complexes would be dismantled, packed onto trains, and transported thousands of kilometers eastward to the regions beyond the Ural Mountains. There, in areas that the German armies could not possibly reach, the factories would be rebuilt and Soviet war production would continue. The decision to evacuate was unprecedented in its scope. No nation had ever attempted to move its entire industrial base under wartime conditions. There were no precedents, no established procedures, no clear understanding of how such a massive operation could be accomplished. Yet the necessity was absolute. Without this evacuation, the Soviet Union faced certain defeat. With it, there was at least a chance, however slender, that Soviet industry could sustain the war effort and that eventual victory might be possible. The organization of the evacuation fell primarily to the State Committee for Defense, chaired by Stalin, and to various Soviet ministries responsible for specific industries. The task was staggering in its complexity. More than 1,500 major industrial enterprises had to be identified, assessed, and scheduled for evacuation. For each factory, decisions had to be made about what equipment was essential and what could be left behind. Priorities had to be established. Weapons factories took precedence over consumer goods facilities. Factories producing ammunition, artillery, tanks, and aircraft were moved first. Those producing non-essential goods were abandoned or destroyed to prevent their capture by German forces. The logistics were nightmarish. The Soviet railway system, already stretched by military needs, had to accommodate the largest industrial relocation in history. Trains had to be requisitioned from the regular transport system, even as the railways were being used to move troops and supplies to the front. Cargo had to be packed and loaded. The specific machinery and equipment that made each factory unique had to be identified, inventoried, and loaded onto rail cars. Some factories were only partially disassembled, others were completely dismantled, with every lathe, every machine tool, every piece of equipment removed. The workers themselves posed both a necessity and a challenge. Factories could not simply be packed up and moved without the skilled workers who operated them. Engineers, technicians, machinists, and other skilled laborers would have to travel with their factories to their new locations. This meant that entire populations would be displaced. In some cases, workers were given the option to volunteer for evacuation. In others, they were conscripted. Either way, families had to be uprooted from their homes with minimal warning. Workers understood that staying behind meant either capture by the Germans or death in the fighting. Yet leaving meant departing for unknown destinations in regions of the Soviet Union most of them had never seen, with no guarantee of what conditions would await them. The evacuations began in July 1941, just weeks after the German invasion. The pace was frantic and often chaotic. Factory managers received orders with little notice. Some orders were contradictory, as different authorities made competing demands on scarce transport capacity. In some cases, factory equipment arrived at its destination before the buildings to house it had been constructed. In others, workers arrived at evacuated facilities where the machinery they were supposed to operate had not yet arrived. Yet, despite the confusion and the enormous logistical challenges, the evacuation proceeded. The first convoys of evacuees began their journeys eastward in the summer of 1941. The routes were long and dangerous. Even far behind the front lines, trains could still be attacked by German aircraft or disrupted by military operations. The journey from Western Russia to the Urals or Siberia could take weeks. Conditions in the trains were primitive. Overcrowding was severe. Food was rationed and often insufficient. Sanitation was poor. The trains carried workers of all ages, including children and elderly family members who had accompanied their relatives into evacuation. As the German invasion continued through the summer and fall of 1941, the scope of the evacuation expanded. Cities were being evacuated. Entire industrial regions were being dismantled. Moscow itself came under threat during the winter of 1941-1942, as German forces reached the outskirts of the Soviet capital. Factories in Moscow and in other threatened cities had to be evacuated with even greater urgency. The scale of movement became even larger and more desperate. The destinations for evacuated factories were primarily the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. These regions had been chosen because they were far beyond the reach of German military operations. The Urals, in particular, had existing industrial capacity and was regarded as the safest location for relocated factories. The towns around Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, and Magnitogorsk would become the primary reception centers for evacuated industry. Equally important were locations in Siberia, particularly around Novosibirsk, and in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan and other Soviet republics. These receiving regions were underdeveloped compared to Western Russia. They lacked adequate housing, adequate food supplies, and adequate infrastructure. The climate was harsh, the distances were vast, yet these regions possessed one crucial advantage: they were beyond German reach. If Soviet industry could be relocated there and rebuilt, it could continue to supply the Red Army regardless of the military situation in the West. By the end of 1941, as German forces had conquered vast territories and approached Moscow, the evacuation was in full operation. Thousands of trains carried machinery, equipment, and workers eastward. The evacuation would continue throughout 1942, as the German advance slowed and eventually halted. By the time the evacuations were largely complete, the face of Soviet industry had been fundamentally transformed. The industrial structure of the Soviet Union had been uprooted and transplanted to the eastern regions. What had been a desperate measure to prevent the loss of Soviet military production capacity had become the foundation of Soviet victory. Part 2. The Great Migration. The evacuation of Soviet industry reached its peak intensity during 1942, even as the Red Army struggled against German forces in a desperate fight for survival. Between July 1941 and the end of 1942, approximately 1,500 major industrial enterprises were relocated from the Western Soviet Union to the eastern regions. The scale of this movement was almost incomprehensible. Thousands of trains, carrying millions of tons of machinery, equipment, and industrial material, snaked across the vast distances of the Soviet Union, moving from west to east, along routes that had become vital arteries for the nation's survival. The railways themselves became the lifeline of this massive operation. The Soviet rail network, which had never been designed to handle such concentrated movement, was pushed to its absolute limits. Regular passenger services were suspended or severely curtailed. Military transport had to compete with evacuation trains for access to the tracks. Coordination between different authorities, the Ministry of Railways, the State Committee for Defense, individual factory managers, and regional administrators was often poor, leading to congestion, delays, and bottlenecks. Yet despite these inefficiencies, the trains kept moving. Convoys would be assembled, loaded with machinery, and dispatched eastward, sometimes with minimal regard for whether their destinations were prepared to receive them. The machinery itself told a story of Soviet industrial achievement. Heavy machine tools, some weighing hundreds of tons, had to be carefully crated and loaded onto flat cars. Textile machinery, printing equipment, and precision instruments had to be protected during transport to prevent damage. Some factories were so large that their evacuation required dozens of freight trains. The Molotov automotive plant in Moscow, which produced aircraft engines, evacuated to Chelyabinsk and required an enormous number of trains to move all its equipment. The great steel mills of Ukraine were gradually dismantled and their most essential components shipped eastward. The process was not efficient. Equipment was sometimes damaged in transit. Some machinery was lost. Some shipments became separated, with components arriving at different times and in different locations. Accompanying the machinery were the workers themselves. The Soviet state, recognizing that factories could not operate without skilled personnel, arranged for the evacuation of entire workforces. Factory managers, engineers, technicians, machinists, and laborers all traveled eastward with their workplaces. For many, this was a voluntary commitment. These workers understood that their skills were essential to the Soviet war effort, and that remaining in territories that would be conquered by Germany meant either death or capture. For others, evacuation was compulsory. Soviet authorities simply conscripted workers and their families, loading them onto trains with minimal notice and few possessions. The families that traveled with the workers made the journey even more difficult. Women and children, elderly parents and relatives, all crowded into the same trains that carried machinery. In many cases, families were separated during the evacuation. Fathers and older sons might depart with their factories on one train, while wives and younger children were assigned to later convoys. Some families never reunited during the war years. The trains themselves were often far from comfortable. Passenger cars, designed to hold dozens, were packed with hundreds. Goods wagons, originally intended for cargo, were converted into makeshift passenger compartments with no amenities. The journey eastward was an ordeal of endurance. From Moscow to the Urals was approximately 2,000 kilometers. From the coal mines of the Donbass to Siberia was even farther, distances that could require 2 or 3 weeks of travel under wartime conditions. Food rations on the trains were minimal. The railway system, itself damaged by the German invasion and German bombing, was disrupted and unreliable. Trains broke down. Routes were blocked. Detours added weeks to journeys. The weather, particularly in autumn and winter, was brutal. Workers and families huddled in unheated cars, struggling against cold, hunger, and despair. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded conditions. Typhus and other diseases claimed lives. The death toll among evacuees during transport was never fully documented, but it was substantial. At the receiving end, in the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia, the situation was hardly better. The regions designated to receive evacuated industry were not prepared for the sudden influx of hundreds of thousands of workers and their families. Housing was desperately inadequate. In many cases, workers arrived at their destinations to find that factories had not yet been reconstructed, that housing did not exist, and that food was in short supply. Temporary accommodations had to be improvised. Workers lived in barracks, in hastily constructed dormitories, in overcrowded communal housing. Families were often separated, with men assigned to factory housing, while wives and children were placed in separate facilities. The reconstruction of factories was a monumental task conducted under impossible conditions. In the Urals, particularly around Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, and Magnitogorsk, new factory buildings were constructed at a feverish pace. The climate of the Urals in winter was brutally cold, often dropping to 50 degrees below 0 Celsius. Workers labored in these conditions, building structures to house the arriving machinery. Concrete had to be heated to prevent freezing. Metal became brittle and difficult to work with in the extreme cold. Yet the work proceeded, driven by the knowledge that every day of delay meant that Soviet weapons production remained suspended. Once the buildings were in place, the machinery had to be installed, tested, and brought into operation. This required not only physical labor, but also technical expertise. Engineers had to figure out how to integrate machinery that had been designed to operate together in one factory into different configurations in new factories. In some cases, they had to improvise, adapting equipment to work in ways it had never been intended to function. Production lines that had been carefully designed and balanced in the West had to be recreated from memory and from whatever documentation had survived the evacuation. The working conditions for evacuated workers were among the harshest imaginable. Factory floors in the Urals and Siberia were often unheated or inadequately heated. Workers labored in temperatures that would have been considered intolerable in peacetime. They worked long hours, 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours per day. The work was dangerous. Industrial accidents in these hastily constructed facilities were common. Food rations for workers were calculated by the amount of production achieved, and those who worked on weapons production received the highest rations. Yet even these rations were often insufficient to sustain workers under such demanding conditions. The evacuation also brought workers into conflict with local populations. The rapid influx of hundreds of thousands of workers from the West into relatively underdeveloped regions created tensions. Local housing markets were disrupted. Competition for scarce resources intensified. Workers from European Russia sometimes looked down on the locals, while local inhabitants resented the outsiders. Cultural differences, language variations, and the strains of wartime created friction. Yet gradually, the evacuated workers became integrated into the communities that received them. The extraordinary demands of war production created a shared purpose that transcended these tensions. By 1942, despite the chaos and the suffering, evacuated factories were beginning to produce weapons. The Chelyabinsk tractor factory, which had been evacuated from near Moscow, was transformed into a tank production facility. It became known as Tankograd, the tank city. By mid-1942, Tankograd was producing more tanks than all of Germany. Other factories followed suit. An aircraft engine factory from Moscow became operational in Chelyabinsk. Ammunition plants, rebuilt in Siberia and Kazakhstan, began supplying the Red Army. Weapons that had been in short supply suddenly became available in increasing quantities. The human cost of this achievement was staggering. Workers died from overwork, malnutrition, cold, and disease. Precise figures are difficult to establish, but tens of thousands of evacuees perished during the evacuation process and in the early years of operation in the East. Children born to evacuated workers in the harsh conditions of Siberia and the Urals often did not survive. Elderly people, unable to adapt to the climate and the demanding work, died in large numbers. The Soviet state did not publicize these losses. It focused instead on the achievement of war production. For many evacuated workers, the experience was transformative. They had been uprooted from their homes, transported across a vast country, and placed in conditions that tested their physical and psychological endurance. Yet their sacrifice was producing results. They could see that their labor was directly contributing to the weapons being used by the Red Army to resist the German invasion. As reports of Soviet military successes began to arrive in late 1942 and early 1943, workers in the eastern factories understood that they had played a crucial role in making those victories possible. The evacuation, which had seemed like a desperate retreat, had become the foundation of eventual Soviet triumph. The transformation of war. By the autumn of 1942, the decision to evacuate Soviet industry had proven its validity in the most dramatic way possible. The statistical evidence was undeniable and astonishing to observers on both sides of the conflict. German military intelligence reported with growing alarm that Soviet weapons production, rather than collapsing under the weight of invasion and territorial loss, was accelerating. Soviet tank production was surpassing German production. Soviet artillery output exceeded that of Nazi Germany. Soviet ammunition factories were supplying munitions at rates that seemed impossible given the devastation of Soviet territory. The evacuation, which had seemed like a desperate gamble, was transforming the nature of the war itself. The transformation was most visible in Chelyabinsk, a city in the Urals that became the symbolic center of Soviet wartime industrial achievement. Before the war, Chelyabinsk had been a modest provincial city with a population of around 300,000. It possessed some industrial capacity, primarily tractor manufacturing, but it was not a major center of Soviet production. The evacuation changed this overnight. The Kirov tank factory from Leningrad and other tank manufacturing facilities were relocated to Chelyabinsk. The city's tractor plant was converted into a tank production facility. By 1942, Chelyabinsk had become the greatest tank-producing center in the world. The workers of Chelyabinsk, many of them evacuated from the Western factories, many of them local laborers drawn into wartime production, achieved production records that astounded Soviet planners and terrified German strategists. In 1942, Chelyabinsk produced over 4,000 tanks. In 1943, production increased further. The city was producing more tanks than the entire German war economy could manufacture. The Soviet T-34 tank, widely regarded as one of the best tank designs of the war, poured out of Chelyabinsk factories in overwhelming numbers. German panzer forces, which had enjoyed overwhelming superiority in the opening months of the war, found themselves increasingly outmatched as Soviet production swamped German manufacturing capacity. The achievement was not limited to tanks. Across the evacuated industrial base, production was reaching levels that sustained a complete transformation of Soviet military power. Aircraft factories in Siberia and the Urals were producing fighter aircraft at rates that allowed the Soviet Air Force to achieve air superiority over contested regions. Ammunition plants were manufacturing artillery shells, rifle ammunition, and bombs in quantities that allowed Soviet field commanders to conduct operations that would have been impossible with the limited supplies available in 1941 and 1942. Small arms production ensured that the Red Army, despite its enormous losses, could continue to equip new formations with weapons. This production was achieved under conditions of extreme hardship that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. The factories operated continuously, often without adequate maintenance. Workers labored in shifts that sometimes extended beyond 12 hours. The northern winters brought temperatures that made outdoor work life-threatening. Malnutrition was endemic, disease was common, yet the factories operated and production continued. Driven by a combination of Soviet state coercion, patriotic commitment to the war effort, and the understanding that the weapons being produced were directly enabling Soviet military resistance to Nazi invasion. The strategic implications of Soviet industrial evacuation and reconstruction became clear during the great battles of 1942 and 1943. At Stalingrad, beginning in August 1942, the Red Army conducted a desperate defense of the city against German assault. The battle lasted months, becoming one of the most brutal and consequential military operations in history. The survival of the Red Army at Stalingrad depended directly on the weapons produced in the evacuated factories. Soviet tanks, artillery, and ammunition manufactured in the Urals and Siberia flowed to the front lines, enabling Soviet commanders to sustain their defense and eventually to counterattack. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad in February 1943 represented a turning point in the war. The German army, which had advanced seemingly unstoppably across the Soviet Union in 1941 and 1942, was defeated and forced to retreat. This victory would not have been possible without the production from the evacuated factories. German military superiority had been based partly on Germany's initial industrial advantage. By 1943, that advantage had been reversed. The Soviet Union, despite having lost vast territories, and despite the immense human and material costs of the invasion, was outproducing Germany in weapons. Following the victory at Stalingrad, the strategic initiative passed to the Soviet Union. The Red Army, equipped with weapons produced in the eastern factories, began a systematic advance westward. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, was fought with tanks produced in Chelyabinsk and other evacuated factories. Soviet forces defeated the Germans and permanently seized the strategic initiative. From that point forward, the Red Army would advance continuously, eventually reaching Berlin in 1945. The success of the evacuated factories in sustaining Soviet war production could not have been achieved without the technical expertise and commitment of the workers. Engineers and technicians, many of whom had been evacuated from the West, worked to optimize production processes and to adapt machinery to new purposes. Factory managers, operating under intense pressure from Soviet authorities and facing severe punishment for failure, drove their workers to achieve unprecedented production rates. The workers themselves, despite the hardships, maintained the discipline and commitment necessary to operate complex industrial facilities under wartime conditions. The psychological impact of the success of the evacuated factories on Soviet society was profound. For a nation that had suffered the trauma of invasion, territorial loss, and enormous casualties, the knowledge that Soviet industry was outproducing Nazi Germany was a source of pride and hope. Propaganda celebrated the achievements of workers in the eastern factories. Newspapers and radio broadcasts highlighted production records. Workers who had been evacuated from the West became symbols of Soviet sacrifice and determination. The evacuation, which had been a traumatic upheaval, was increasingly portrayed as a demonstration of Soviet organizational capacity and revolutionary commitment. Yet the success of the evacuated factories came at a cost that was largely hidden from public awareness. The death toll among evacuated workers and their families remained officially undocumented and unacknowledged. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands perished during the evacuation process and in the early years of operation in the eastern factories. Many more suffered from malnutrition, disease, and the effects of overwork. Children born during the evacuation often did not survive their early years. The human cost of Soviet war production was immense, but it was a cost that the Soviet state was willing to pay in pursuit of victory. By 1944 and 1945, as German military defeat became inevitable, the evacuated factories had become the foundation of Soviet industrial might. The Soviet Union, which in 1941 had faced the prospect of industrial collapse, had not only survived but had emerged as a major industrial power capable of supporting military operations on a massive scale. The evacuation had preserved Soviet industrial capacity and had, paradoxically, strengthened it by distributing production across a broader geographic area and by spurring the development of new industrial regions. After the war, the question arose whether the evacuated factories would return to their original locations in the West or remain in their new homes in the Urals and Siberia. The Soviet leadership made a decision that reflected the strategic lessons of the war. The factories would remain in the East. The evacuation, which had been intended as a temporary wartime measure, became permanent. The Soviet Union invested in further developing the industrial base in the Urals and Siberia. New factories were built to supplement the evacuated facilities. The Urals became the center of Soviet heavy industry, a position it would maintain throughout the Cold War and beyond. The transformation of the Urals and Siberia from underdeveloped regions into major industrial centers represented one of the most significant geographic shifts in Soviet economic development. Cities like Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, and Magnitogorsk grew into major metropolitan centers. The population of the eastern regions increased dramatically. A new Soviet industrial geography had been created, one that reflected the strategic necessities of total war and the choices made during the evacuation crisis. The Soviet factory evacuation stands as one of history's greatest achievements in wartime logistics and industrial organization. In the face of military invasion and the threat of total defeat, the Soviet state had made the audacious decision to relocate its entire industrial base thousands of kilometers eastward. Despite enormous challenges, despite the chaos of wartime conditions, despite suffering and loss on a vast scale, the evacuation had been accomplished. The factories had been rebuilt, production had been restored and expanded, and Soviet war production had surpassed that of Nazi Germany. The evacuated factories had provided the material foundation for Soviet military victory. Without the evacuation, Soviet defeat would have been virtually certain. With it, the path to eventual triumph had been opened.